We're now joined by a stellar panel tonight. Mark Linscott, former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative; Arun Singh, former Indian Ambassador to the United States; Abhijit Das, international trade policy expert, an expert on WTO affairs. Let me start with you, Mark. Mark, how do you see these statements by Howard Lutnick at a time when India has completed negotiations? Even Jamieson Greer said that India has offered the best ever deal. What's stopping things? And how do you read these statements by Lutnick, who's saying that you don't have a deal because Modi did not call the president in time, and what was negotiated and agreed upon earlier does not exist?
Yeah, thanks, Parkshit. Well, I've got a couple of reactions to the comments by Secretary Lutnick. First, I think he's right. I mean, it's clear that the president is the closer of trade deals. I mean, that's been manifest for the entirety of this administration. He is trade negotiator in chief, and he often will close these deals. I do think it's important to highlight that Howard Lutnick is not negotiating the deal with India. There have been detailed negotiations for some months. I think there's been a lot of progress, strong efforts by both sides to reach a mutually beneficial deal. And that's being done by the U.S. Trade Representative's office. That's Jamieson Greer, the U.S. Trade Representative, and his team working with Minister Goyal and the senior staff with the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. I think where we still have a big gap and what is holding up more progress is what is the reciprocal tariff rate that will apply. I think India wants some clarity on that. Will it be 19%? Will it be 15%? That's what the EU got. And I think they're still trying to figure that out. And that probably will have to involve a decision between the two leaders.
That's right. And I guess that's the only conversation that's possibly left as of now, even though the Indian government claims, and they've said this, and this is what the MEA also said, didn't they, Ambassador Arun Singh, that we've been close to a deal several times over the course of 1 year. Prime Minister Modi and President Trump have spoken 8 times on various issues, including the trade deal. How do you read these statements, Ambassador Arun Singh, as a veteran of India-US affairs? Are you optimistic still about a trade deal, or you're in the negative?
No, the trade deal will happen at some stage. But what Howard Lutnick has said is, from the US perspective, not something new. We had heard similar things way back towards the end of July. And this is just relitigating an old story. And clearly the perception in India was very, very different. And I think what happened was that at a time when they were doing the trade agreement with India, the India-US trade agreement was broadly a balanced trade agreement. There were benefits for both sides. There were concessions made by both sides. And at precisely that time, US was getting unilateral advantages in the trade agreements they had with other countries. Now, for example, with the EU, US imposed 15% tariffs and got EU to commit to buy $750 billion worth of energy from the US and invest $600 billion in the US. Similarly, Japan promised to invest $500 billion in the US, and US said that this would work like a sovereign wealth fund for Japan, for the United States, and they would invest where they wanted, and after some time, bulk of the profits would be invested in the US, would go to the US Treasury. Similarly, South Korea promised to invest $350 billion in the United States. So these are countries and entities that are security dependent on the United States. As a result of that dependence, they were coerced into making unilateral concessions. And I think at the time when President Trump was projecting domestically that he's getting unilateral advantage in all his trade agreements, it didn't work for him to project a trade agreement where there was a balanced advantage for both sides. So he gave up on that option and then chose instead to impose 25% tariffs on India. So I think it is not a question of whether the leaders are talking or not talking. It's a question of what was working for President Trump domestically. Now, the unfortunate thing is that for his domestic gain or perception of domestic gain, he was prepared to throw the India-US relationship under the bus, which is what he did. Because right now in India, there is a perception that US is unilateral, it is coercive, and one needs to relook at the trajectory of the India-US relationship.
Okay. Abhijit Das, what's your sense now? The United States is wanting more from India. The negotiations may be complete, as even Jamieson Greer noted, before US lawmakers. But does the United States at this stage want more? And this is the indication?
Parikshit, thanks for having me on your program. I'm reminded of one of the characters in Charles Dickens' classic novel, who always wanted more. He asked for more. I think President Trump and United States administration is echoing that tendency. And clearly, it's very difficult to satisfy the appetite of United States for concessions. And of course, to some extent, we are also responsible for it. We started giving concessions even before the negotiations had started. And to my mind, that is not the best way to negotiate. Bear in mind that in the last budget, we gave some concessions which were aimed at appeasing the United States. And now we are seeing the results. Whatever we put on the table, even if it's the best offer from the Indian side, doesn't seem to meet the expectations of President Trump. His expectations keep on going up. And given that reality, I'm not very optimistic that we will end up with a balanced agreement at the end of the day.
Right. Absolutely. And this has been a concern among many Indian diplomats and also trade experts that India has given too many concessions. We've shown very strong statements and gestures of intent outside the formal legal text. And all of that has been pocketed by the United States, and they're wanting more over and over again. Now, coming back to the issue of the Supreme Court verdict on tariffs. Mark, this was supposed to happen on Friday, but perhaps it's now going to happen in the coming weeks and days. Could you give us a sense on how this could impact Donald Trump's tariff strategy? We believe that possibly the Supreme Court is going to be united on striking them down, but maybe not entirely.
Yeah, I mean, let me just go back to your first question briefly. I'm not quite as cold-blooded as Ambassador Singh and Mr. Das. I don't think that the U.S. administration is pushing for a lot more. I think the contours of a package are becoming quite clear. There's been plenty of press that the administration seeks more and more in sensitive areas like GMO products and dairy, and I don't think that's the case for a phase one agreement. I think it's coming down to what will be the reciprocal tariff and reaching agreement on that. And I'm bullish. I still am quite hopeful that can be done relatively soon. With respect to the Supreme Court, it could go three ways. It could be a decision that finds the tariffs under IEEPA constitutional. On the other hand, it could find those tariffs to be unconstitutional. Or the third scenario is something in between. But what is clear is that the administration has a plan B. I mean, I think they've had a plan B from the very moment they imposed the IEEPA tariffs. They knew they were going to get sued. They understood that there might be the possibility of losing that case. And they've been ready with other authorities. There is Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act, which would provide the possibility of imposing 15% tariffs. There's a more nuclear option. That's Section 338 of the 1930 Trade Act, which would allow tariffs up to 50%, with no real process associated with that. So I think if the Supreme Court decides against the administration, we'll see it roll out another authority for tariffs. I think we can be confident that tariffs in some form at some level across the board will remain in place. I don't see them going higher, but I think there will be alternative authorities they use to continue to apply tariffs.
Right. Abhijit Das, do you believe that there are companies, US companies, global firms who have filed cases in the Supreme Court seeking that the tariffs be struck down. They've sought refunds as well. Do you think if these IPA tariffs are struck down to some extent, there could be a major refund that the US government may have to pay out as a result? And would there be a way around it?
First and foremost, Parikshit, I completely agree with Mark when he says that the Trump administration already has a plan B in place. And I'm not very well versed with the US law in respect of the various sections of different trade acts. But even if there are refunds, how much of it will accrue to the importers who imported from Indian exporters, that will remain to be seen. But that will do very little to boost our exports in future if Plan B gets unleashed by President Trump. So even if the US Supreme Court overturns the IEEPA tariffs, we really cannot be optimistic that our exporters will see better prospects in the US market once Plan B and other tariffs get imposed. So, well, that's where it is. And it will only result in greater uncertainty. We are also hearing about threats of imposing 500% tariffs on India on account of Russian oil. So all that is likely to unleash further miseries on Indian exporters.
Further miseries on Indian exporters, for sure. We're going to take a short break, but we will return to all our guests. We'll also tell you what the economic advisor of White House has said a short while back with regard to the tariff ruling. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Global Lens. We're discussing the implications, the possible outcomes from the US Supreme Court ruling on Trump's tariffs. Let's listen in to Kevin Hassett, White House economic advisor.
You know, certainly there's a high level of confidence that the Supreme Court's going to side with us. We think that we're really on firm ground. But I know you expect us to say that. And so then the question is, well, what if we're wrong about that? And it's important to think about that, too. There was a big call last night with all the principals to talk about if the Supreme Court were to rule against this IEEPA tariff, what would the next step be? And Jameson Greer is all over it. There are a lot of other legal authorities that can reproduce the deals that we've made with other countries and can do so basically immediately. And so our expectation is that we're going to win. And if we don't win, then we know that we've got other tools that we can use that get us to the same place.
All right. Let me now go across to Ambassador Arun Singh. Ambassador Singh, what are the possible implications for India out of this Supreme Court ruling on tariffs, which is now imminent in the next few days?
Parikshit, I think the implications are not so much for India as the domestic processes within the US. The Supreme Court ruling at best would say that the president does not have the authority to levy tariffs under IEEPA, and that this belongs to the US Congress. So it looks at the question of checks and balances in the US system. And as Kevin Hassett pointed out, that if that happens, they will look at other authorizations based on which they'll try and reimpose the tariffs. Now, following that, there will be more litigation in the US. There would be the importers who litigate about getting the kind of refunds they want. So that is going to go on. I think from India's perspective, we should focus more on the fact that US needs to remove the additional 25% tariff they have put for India buying Russian oil, because China buys more Russian oil and they didn't impose any tariffs on China. Europe has been buying more overall from Russia than India has been buying oil. And US itself has been importing $750 million worth of uranium from Russia. So there is no justification for posing that those tariffs on India. Now, related to the Supreme Court hearing, I think the only issue with direct relevance to India is that in that filing before the Supreme Court, the US administration has specifically cited that they levied the additional 25% tariffs on India to try and resolve the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because they wanted to project that they were levying tariffs for foreign policy purposes where the president has a mandate. So if there the Supreme Court rules against the administration, then their justification that they have cited for the additional 25% tariffs on India goes away. So maybe that gives them a peg to take away those tariffs if they would like to advance the US-India relationship. So I should think we should really focus on how the tariffs related to Russian oil need to be taken away. Plus, of course, US needs to sign off on the trade deal that has been negotiated in great detail by the negotiators on both sides.
Right. Let me now go back to Mark. Mark, clearly we're looking at some protracted litigation. Do you expect this to impact investor sentiment in the US in the weeks and months to come, the uncertainty? And number two, what could be the possibility of the US Supreme Court ordering refunds and mass refunds?
Yeah, in terms of investor sentiment, it's hard to predict. I mean, we've had the IEEPA and tariffs in place for some months now, and investors have not rushed out of the market. There was one day or a couple of days of reactions, and that was on April 2nd, so-called Liberation Day, when the IEEPA tariffs were first announced. They were then suspended. It was clear that the president was a little concerned about how investors had reacted, how the markets had reacted. But then several months later, when there was a new set of reciprocal tariffs announced and then imposed, markets basically reacted in a pretty sober way. So, it's tough to say what the markets will do. I think what's more important in terms of market reactions, investor reactions, is what's happening with the U.S. economy. What are the numbers in terms of employment? Where's inflation going? And does it look like the tariffs are contributing to inflation, what's being referred to as affordability in the United States now? What is the contribution of the tariffs? The markets, I think, are more likely to react to those numbers. And that's perhaps one reason why we are not seeing the tariffs going up. I mean, it's been several months since new tariffs have been applied. We seem to be in a bit of a stable situation. I think the administration is concerned about increasing tariffs and what it means for the U.S. economy. Refunds, that's a big question. And if alternative authorities are found, what are the...
Yeah, Mark, that's what I'd like to ask you about refunds. What's the prospect of mass refunds in this case, and how will the government act if those refunds are ordered?
I can't even begin to predict that. I mean, that is just a really hard question about how this administration... I mean, this administration surprises us every day, from snatching Maduro from Venezuela to comments on Greenland to new tariff announcements. How will they react in terms of an order to provide refunds? It's, I really can't authoritatively note that. I do want to highlight, though, I think Ambassador Singh raises some very important points. I agree that the penalty tariffs associated with Russian oil should be lifted as soon as possible. The trend lines are very good in terms of India's purchases of Russian oil. I don't know how the Supreme Court will rule on that particular tariff, but I think it's in the interest of the administration to eliminate that tariff based on what they've seen out of India, as opposed to being forced to do that by the Supreme Court. So hopefully we'll see action on that as soon as possible.
Right. My final question to Abhijit Das. There is still a possibility of those 500% tariffs becoming a reality because Trump has approved that bill. It will now be taken up by the US Congress. Abhijit Das, what would happen if that bill were to become a reality?
Well, if that bill becomes a reality and there's a fair prospect of that happening, I think the Indian government will have to relook at its strategy of continuing to engage with US through the bilateral trade negotiations. I think there will need to be a hard look at taking some retaliatory action against the United States. That's what the present government had done in respect of the steel and aluminum tariffs under Trump 1, I do think that if the 500% tariffs do kick in, India will need to have a hard look at adopting a different strategy vis-a-vis US. The present approach of continuing to talk through the negotiations, maybe that would have run its course if the 500% tariffs become a reality.
So, Parikshit, if I could just make,
Yeah.
Parikshit, if I could just
Please go
make
ahead,
one
please go
point here, that we should be a little cautious. I doubt if US is going to impose 500% tariffs on China,
I agree.
given China's market power. So if they're not able to do that, how they will handle it, something we should watch. We shouldn't get unduly worried at this stage. It's a domestic process playing out in the US.
Okay. And Mark, do you also feel that this will get passed to the US Congress, or do you think it will not pass muster?
Well, I don't know. It could get through the U.S. Congress, but I think the president will have discretion in terms of those tariffs, and I don't think we'll see a 500% tariff. I agree completely with Ambassador Singh. I think that the administration should look to remove the tariffs as soon as possible and not appear to be directed by the Supreme Court to remove those tariffs. I think there will be discretion under that legislation, if it's passed, the Lindsey Graham bill that would allow the president to waive those for India.
All right. Thank you very much, Mark Linscott, for joining us, and Ambassador Arun Singh and Abhijit Das for taking our time on